Welcome to the very first episode of Stump the Priest, a new program at St. Philip's where people are invited to submit questions to Stump the Priest. And we have our very first question today from Stephen Chan, who writes this. We know something of the animosity between the mainline Jewish community and the Samaritans from the Gospels. The historical roots are easily researched, but I'm curious about how these communities evolved after Jesus' time. Did this animosity survive the later Jewish revolt and into the diaspora? Does the Samaritan version of the Pentateuch survive for some sect of the Jewish people? Well, thank you, Stephen, for submitting this question. And it's a good stumper because while we know about the Samaritans from the Gospels, I did not know really anything about the answer to your question, except a little bit I gleaned on our pilgrimage a few years ago when we traveled to Samaria as part of our pilgrimage and went to Nablus, the town at the foot of Mount Gerizim, which was the kind of center of the Samaritans, and in fact visited the Orthodox Church, where in the basement you could still visit the well at Sychar, where Jesus met the Samaritan woman, Jacob's well, it's called. And so we did get a little glimpse into the Samaritan world on our trip. But this question of what happened to the Samaritans is a really good one. To back up, for those who don't have the same background as Stephen, let me just do a thumbnail sketch of who the Samaritans were. The Samaritans were a group, we know from the Gospels, who were Jewish to a point, but had separated from sort of mainline Judaism, as Stephen said in his question, at some point. So what caused the dispute? What caused the rift between Jews and Samaritans? It's a rather complicated history, and it goes back quite a way. So if you think about the history of Israel, and I'm sure you all have it at the, at the tip of your fingers, at the time of King David and King Solomon, there was one united country of Israel that had been expanded under King David, and then Solomon inherited that. But when Solomon died, the kingdom was split. The northern kingdom, which included the ancient kingdom of Samaria, was called Israel, and the southern kingdom, which included Jerusalem, was called Judah. And there was a kind of, if you think about America, you know, the northerners and the southerners, there's just a little history there. Well, there was too with the people of Israel and the people of Judah. They had different versions of some of their sacred stories, and they had different practices. And one of the most important practices was in the northern kingdom, there had been an ancient tradition of worshiping God on various hilltop shrines. And in the south, once the temple was built at the time of Solomon, which we've been reading about on Sundays, the Jerusalem-centered Judaism really focused then on the temple, that this new glorious temple was now the only valid place to worship God. Whereas in the north, particularly the Samaritans were worshiping on Mount Gerizim. And in fact, there was a dispute between which mountain God had given the 10 Commandments on. Was it Mount Sinai or was it Mount Gerizim? So there was a dispute even way back, going even before the building of the temple. So catastrophe happens in the year 722 BC, so we're still talking a long time ago, and the northern kingdom of Israel is conquered by the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire conquers the northern kingdom, and they are now separated. Many of the leaders of the people are, it was a common practice to exile the leaders of the people, the intelligentsia, scatter them throughout the Assyrian Empire so they couldn't band together and lead people in a revolt. Some of the people left behind are the people that Samaritans claim as their ancestors. So the Jewish leaders were exiled and the Samaritans remained, is one sort of easy way to think about it. So the Samaritans continue to worship on Mount Gerizim in their hilltop shrine, and they continue to have practices which over time get less and less similar to mainline Judaism as it was being practiced in Jerusalem. For instance, they had a different version of the scriptures. They both shared the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But whereas the mainline Jewish community added to those the prophetic books, think of Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, the minor prophets, Amos, Hosea, Obadiah, etc., and the writings, things like Psalms, Proverbs, and remember, Psalms are written for the temple, so it's very temple-based religion. Samaritans only have the Torah, only have those first 5 books. So where do you worship? It's different. For the Jews in Jerusalem, it's the temple. For the Samaritans, it's Mount Gerizim. What's your Bible? For the Jews in Jerusalem, it's the whole of the what we now call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. For the Samaritans, it's only the Torah, and they had a slightly different version of the Torah as well, which we'll come back to in a second. So all that's kind of the background, and then things got testy. You know, as we get closer to the time of Jesus, there were a variety of different conquerors. After the Assyrians, the Babylonians, then the Greeks, the Seleucids, and so there's an uprising, and you can read about it in the books of the Maccabees in the 2nd century BC. And the Maccabees briefly reclaim Jerusalem and reestablish a sort of Jewish kingdom there. And one of the Maccabee leaders, John Hyrcanus, decides that this is a great opportunity to consolidate the religion of Judaism. And so he goes and destroys the temple on Mount Gerizim, and then a few years later goes and destroys Samaria and the city of Shechem. So he really took the opportunity to stick it to the Samaritans while he was the leader. So the Samaritans are kind of surviving, they're hanging in there, but they must have been super relieved when the Romans came and reestablished a new empire in that area, suppressing the Maccabees. And the Emperor Pompey conquers Palestine about 64 BC. The Samaritans decided that it was in their best interest to develop good relations with the Romans because they didn't get along with the Jewish community in Jerusalem. And they also got along with the puppet kings, the Herods. So the Samaritans have a cozy relationship with Rome and with Herod. And then, of course, we get to the time of Jesus. So that's the background to the animosity. So what happens after that? Well, if you think of Jesus' life, we often think we're not, 100% sure, but pretty much think that his death and resurrection happened around 33 AD, or Common Era, as the historians call it now. And then there's a period of time where there are a number of uprisings. And the Romans decide finally, Vespasian, the Emperor Vespasian, to finally put down this revolt, this Jewish revolt, in the year 70 AD. So that is when Herod's temple, the second temple, is destroyed. That's the famous time of Masada. And Vespasian rebuilds the city of Shechem. Remember, the Samaritans had good relations with the Romans. So Vespasian rebuilds Shechem, renames it after himself, the new city, Flavia Neapolis, the new city of Flavius Vespasian, and that is what becomes the modern city of Nablus, which is where we visited on our pilgrimage. So there is a Samaritan community which survives after the destruction of the temple. They're still worshiping on Mount Gerizim. They still have their Torah, their version of the Torah, and they're still kind of eking out an existence. I can't find too much, I'm sure there is some history, but I can't find too much about what happens after that. I know that, so the Samaritans are still going, still kind of carrying on with their life, but I don't have much until modern times. So I do know that there are still Samaritans who live in that area. Let's see, I'll read you a couple things I found. By the 20th century, the Samaritan population had dwindled to fewer than 200 people. So just hanging in there, but just by a thumbnail. It grew a little bit. So by about 10 years ago, there were about 800 Samaritans left, in a very insular community. I think of the Druze community also in the Holy Land. There's a number of these ancient sects and groups that are still kind of very insular, keeping their own traditions. Only recently have men been allowed to marry women from outside the Samaritan community. Women are not allowed to marry outside the community. They have to keep that Samaritan tribe going. They were living in Nablus mostly, but they have now been split and moved to two different communities. Holon is an Israeli city where they live, and also a city in the West Bank. They mostly speak in a kind of Aramaic, an ancient dialect of Hebrew, but they now also speak Arabic as their vernacular. And then the Samaritans who live in modern Israel also speak modern Israeli Hebrew. So that, I hope, is a short answer to your question, Stephen, maybe more than you wanted. But yes, the Samaritans are still hanging in there. So it's interesting, after the destruction of the temple, you see this real separation. And so there are really three versions of the Torah, which I want to get to that other question, what kind of Torah do they read? So there are really three versions of the Torah which continue after the time of Jesus. And the first is what's called the Masoretic text. That's the official Hebrew text that the Hebrew scribes had put together of the Torah, of the first 5 books of the Bible, that is to this day still used as the basis for Judaism. Then there was the Samaritan Torah, which was slightly different. Scholars have found about 6,000 differences in either spelling or some passages between the Masoretic Hebrew Torah and the Samaritan Torah. And that is still used by Samaritans. And I just read in 2013, a new English translation of the Samaritan Torah was discovered. And some of the scrolls that were found in Qumran in the caves actually matched closer to the Samaritan Torah in some regards. And so scholars are now taking a new look at the Samaritan Torah as a source for biblical scholarship, whereas before they had only based their scholarship on the Masoretic Hebrew Torah. So it's kind of interesting if you're a language scholar to see how that has progressed. And then the Christians did not use either of those. The Christians, after the time of Jesus, and during the time of Jesus, were using a Greek translation of the Hebrew Masoretic text, and that was called the Septuagint. It was the Greek Old Testament that was the basis for the writers of the Gospels and the writing of the New Testament. When they quoted the Old Testament, they were quoting the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So just a little more linguistic background. So Samaritans still existing, still reading their version of the Torah, still worshiping in Mount Gerizim, and still sort of eking out an existence in the modern world. Thanks, and feel free to submit your questions to Stump the Priest. You can find the links on our website, stpfeeds.org. Have a great day.